Sometimes the cruelest winters do not come from the sky. They come from the people we trust. The snow had been falling since before dawn, covering the mountains of northern Montana in a blanket of white that seemed endless. Pine trees stood silent beneath the weight of fresh powder. Their branches bowed like old men carrying memories too heavy to set down. The wind moved through the forest with a low, mournful whistle, stirring drifts across the narrow road that wound between the hills. Inside an aging pickup truck, Walter Hayes sat quietly in the passenger seat, his weathered hands folded over a wool blanket resting across his lap. At 78 years old, he looked smaller than he once had. Age had thinned his frame and silvered every strand of his hair, but his pale blue eyes still carried the steady calm of a man who had survived difficult seasons before. Beside him, Ethan Hayes kept both hands on the steering wheel. His jaw was tight. His eyes never left the road. The heater hummed softly between them, filling the cab with dry warmth while snowflakes drifted across the windshield. For nearly an hour, neither man had spoken much. Walter watched the passing trees and thought about his wife. Margaret had been gone for 6 years now, yet every winter still reminded him of her. She had loved the snow, loved the way it made the world seem quieter, gentler. Earlier that morning, Ethan had unexpectedly arrived at his father's small farmhouse. He had offered to take him for a drive, said they could visit Margaret's grave before the weather worsened. Walter had been surprised. Ethan rarely visited anymore. Life had a way of creating distance between people. At least that was what Walter always told himself. He preferred explanations that hurt less. As the truck climbed higher into the mountains, Walter glanced out the window. Something felt wrong. The cemetery was south of town. They were heading north. He looked toward his son. Ethan's face remained expressionless. The silence between them seemed heavier now. Outside, the wind strengthened. Snow swept across the road in pale ribbons. Walter gently cleared his throat. "Son." Ethan didn't answer immediately. His grip tightened slightly on the wheel. Walter forced a small smile. "You sure we're going the right way?" For a moment, only the sound of tires crunching over packed snow filled the cab. Then Ethan nodded once. Too quickly, too stiffly. Walter felt a faint unease settle inside his chest. The road ahead narrowed. The forest thickened. Cell service had disappeared miles ago. Somewhere deep in the woods, a raven called once before vanishing into the storm. Then, without warning, Ethan slowed the truck and pulled onto a deserted clearing surrounded by towering pines. The engine idled. Neither man moved. Walter stared through the windshield at the empty white landscape ahead. And for the first time that day, he noticed that his son's hands were trembling. Walter kept staring through the windshield as snow drifted across the clearing in slow spirals. The world beyond the glass looked untouched, almost peaceful. Yet something deep inside him felt unsettled. He had spent enough years in difficult places to recognize when silence carried weight. Ethan finally shifted in his seat and reached toward the dashboard. The engine shut off. Instantly, the warmth inside the truck began to fade. Neither man spoke. The only sound was the wind brushing against the doors and the faint ticking of cooling metal. Walter looked down at his hands. Resting beneath the blanket was a worn silver chain. Attached to it hung an old military dog tag polished smooth by decades of use. His thumb moved across the edges automatically. It was a habit he had never lost. Margaret used to tease him about it. She would smile and say that whenever he touched that tag, he disappeared into another time. The memory brought a faint smile to his face. For a moment, he could almost hear her laughter. Warm, gentle, familiar. Then the smile faded. Ethan opened his door and stepped into the snow. Cold air rushed into the cab. Walter watched his son walk several feet away before stopping near the tree line. His shoulders were tense, his posture uncertain. It looked less like a man taking in the scenery and more like someone wrestling with something heavy inside his own heart. Walter slowly opened his door and stepped out as well. The cold struck immediately. The wind carried the scent of pine, snow, and distant wood smoke from some unseen cabin miles away. He pulled his coat tighter around himself. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The clearing stretched perhaps 50 yards across, surrounded on all sides by towering evergreens. There were no houses, no roads, no signs of life, only winter. Walter glanced toward Ethan. "This is not the cemetery." Ethan lowered his eyes. For several seconds, he said nothing. The silence felt longer than it really was. Walter studied his son carefully. He remembered another winter many years ago when Ethan was only 9. The boy had fallen through thin ice while chasing a sled near the creek behind their farm. Walter had jumped into freezing water without a second thought. He remembered carrying Ethan home wrapped in his own coat. He remembered Margaret crying with relief when they reached the house. He remembered the promise he made that night. As long as he lived, his son would never face hardship alone. The memory lingered painfully now. Ethan finally spoke, but his voice barely rose above the wind. "Dad." The single word hung in the cold air. Walter waited. Somewhere overhead, a gust of wind rattled snow from the pine branches. White powder drifted through the gray afternoon light. Ethan swallowed hard and looked away. Walter's fingers tightened around the old dog tag beneath his coat. The unease inside him deepened. Whatever was about to happen had been building for a long time. And standing there beneath the falling snow, he suddenly realized that this drive had never been about visiting Margaret at all. The wind moved harder through the trees now, carrying needles of snow across the clearing. Walter stood quietly, his boots sinking slightly into the fresh powder. He watched Ethan carefully. A father spends a lifetime learning the expressions of his child. Even after 40 years, Walter could still recognize when something was wrong. What he saw in Ethan's face was not anger. It was not sadness either. It was exhaustion. The kind that settles into a person after too many bad decisions. Ethan finally lifted his eyes. They were red around the edges. "I did not know what else to do," he said softly. Walter frowned. "What are you talking about?" Ethan looked toward the truck instead of answering. Snow gathered on his jacket shoulders. The silence stretched between them. Then the words came out all at once. The debts. The overdue notices. The failed business investment. The second mortgage he had hidden from everyone. Walter listened without interruption. Months of desperation poured out of his son like water through a broken dam. Ethan spoke about phone calls he no longer answered. About bills he could not pay. About people demanding money he did not have. Walter felt a deep ache growing in his chest. Not because of the money. Money comes and goes. It always has. What hurt was hearing how long his son had been carrying this burden alone. "Why did you not tell me?" Walter asked quietly. Ethan laughed bitterly. "Tell you what? That I ruined everything." Walter shook his head. "That you needed help." Ethan stared at the snow-covered ground. "You would not understand." Walter almost smiled at that. The sentence sounded exactly like something Ethan used to say when he was 16. "Some things never changed." "Try me," Walter replied. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind continued its lonely song through the pines. Then Ethan took a slow breath. "The property." Walter's expression hardened slightly. "What about it?" "It is worth a lot now." There it was. The truth standing naked between them. The old farmhouse. The acreage. The land Walter and Margaret had spent decades building together. Developers had been calling for years. Walter always refused. To him, it was not real estate. It was home. Ethan swallowed. "If you sold it." Walter slowly shook his head. "No." The answer came immediately. Not angry. Not loud. Simply certain. Ethan closed his eyes. The disappointment on his face seemed almost painful to watch. Walter stepped closer. Snowflakes settled across his silver hair. "Son, land cannot fix what is broken inside a man." Ethan looked away. "Easy for you to say." Walter felt those words land harder than the cold. He studied his son's face and saw something he had not noticed before. Fear. Real fear. Not of losing money. Not of embarrassment. Fear of a future that felt impossible to escape. Walter wanted to reach out. Wanted to tell him there was still time to make things right. But before he could speak, Ethan suddenly turned toward the truck. His movements were quick now. Restless. Uncertain. Walter watched him open the driver's door. Then the engine roared back to life. And for the first time that afternoon, a feeling colder than the winter air settled deep within Walter Hayes. Walter stood motionless as the truck idled a few yards away. Snow drifted between him and the vehicle like a curtain slowly being pulled closed. For a moment, he told himself he was imagining things. Surely Ethan was turning around. Surely there had been some misunderstanding. But then the headlights shifted. The truck began moving. Slowly at first, then a little faster. Walter felt his stomach sink. "Ethan," he called out. His voice was calm, almost gentle. The kind of voice a father uses when he still believes he can reach his child. The truck continued forward. Walter took several steps through the snow. "Ethan." This time the wind carried his words away. The taillights grew smaller against the white landscape. Walter stopped walking. The realization arrived quietly, not like a thunderclap, more like a door closing somewhere deep inside his heart. The clearing fell silent again except for the whisper of snow moving across the ground. He stood there for several seconds, staring at the empty road. Then he lowered his eyes and took a slow breath. Anger never came. Neither did hatred. Only sadness. A father can survive many things. Disappointment often hurts the most. The temperature continued dropping as afternoon surrendered to evening. Gray clouds thickened overhead. Walter understood enough about winter mountains to know he could not remain standing still. He adjusted his coat and looked around. Somewhere beyond the trees there might be a ranger station, a hunting cabin, perhaps even a road with passing traffic. The odds were not good, but soldiers learned long ago that hope was never measured by odds. He began walking. Each step sank several inches into fresh snow. The cold bit through his gloves and crept into his boots. Pine trees surrounded him in every direction, their dark trunks stretching upward into a sky the color of steel. The scent of evergreen filled the air. It reminded him of Christmas mornings decades ago when Ethan was small and Margaret would wake before sunrise to bake cinnamon rolls. The memory warmed him for a moment. Walter reached beneath his coat and pulled out the old dog tag hanging from its silver chain. Snowflakes landed on the metal before melting away. He rubbed the worn surface with his thumb. One side carried his name. The other carried a date few people remembered anymore. Margaret always said the tag looked ordinary to everyone except him. To Walter it represented every promise he had tried to keep, every friend he had lost, every blessing he had been given afterward. The wind strengthened. He tucked the tag back beneath his coat and continued forward. Minutes passed, then nearly an hour. The light faded faster than he expected. His legs grew heavier. His breathing became visible in short white clouds. Still he kept moving. Then, somewhere far beyond the trees, another sound emerged. Faint, distant, almost impossible to identify. Walter stopped and listened. It came again. A single bark carried through the winter air. Deep, sharp, determined. And for reasons he could not explain, the sound made him lift his head and keep walking. The bark came again, louder this time, echoing through the forest like a signal cutting through the white haze. Walter paused and squinted into the gathering twilight. The sound came from slightly to the right, somewhere near a ridge where the snow had formed in uneven drifts. He moved carefully, stepping over fallen branches and patches of ice, his boots sinking into the cold powder with each step. The air was sharper here, and the scent of pine and wet earth mingled with the crispness of the falling snow. Then, out of the shadows, a large German shepherd emerged. The dog was tall, with a sable coat that glistened even in the dim light, and amber eyes that seemed to pierce through the gray afternoon. Walter froze, unsure whether to speak. The dog approached, cautiously at first, then stopped a few feet away and tilted its head, as if assessing him. Behind the dog, another figure appeared, moving through the snow with careful, measured steps. A man in a dark winter jacket, his posture steady, his eyes alert, scanned the clearing quickly before focusing on Walter. "Sir, are you all right?" the man asked, his voice calm but carrying an authority that made Walter straighten involuntarily. The German shepherd shifted closer to the man, tail low but wagging slightly, then turned back to Walter and barked once, short and urgent. The sound seemed to push the cold away for a moment. Walter nodded faintly, still shivering, his breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. The man crouched slightly, gesturing for Walter to move toward a small clearing beyond the trees. "Come on, this way. We have shelter not far from here," he said. Walter followed, each step slower than the last, snow crunching beneath his boots. The dog ran slightly ahead, then back, keeping pace as if guiding him. Walter noticed the careful coordination between the man and the dog, a silent communication he had seen in military drills but never expected to witness now. They reached a modest cabin tucked into the hillside, smoke curling from a small chimney. The man opened the door and gestured inside. Walter stepped in, the warmth immediately noticeable against the cold that had been biting through him for hours. The dog padded inside after him, sniffing the air and then settling near the hearth. Walter sank onto a sturdy wooden chair, rubbing his hands together. "You found me," he murmured, voice low. almost in disbelief. The man smiled faintly, kneeling to scratch the dog behind its ears. "Rex would not have let you remain out here," he said simply. Walter looked at the pair, man and dog, and felt a fragile sense of relief settling in. The wind continued to howl outside, snow piling against the cabin walls, but inside, there was a sense of calm, of presence, of life preserved. Walter held the dog tag in his hand once more, feeling the weight of survival, of care, and of trust extended to him in this frozen wilderness. The cabin smelled of pine and old wood smoke, a faint reminder of winter's past. Walter sank deeper into the chair, feeling the heat seeping into his chilled bones. Rex settled beside him, his warm body a steady presence, eyes flicking to Walter as if checking that he was all right. The man who had found him, Ryan Carter, knelt nearby, unpacking a small thermos of coffee and a tin of dry bread. "Drink this," Ryan said softly, handing the thermos across the table. Walter took it with trembling hands, the liquid warming his fingers before he took a careful sip. Outside, the wind moaned through the trees, rattling the roof and windows, but inside, the space was quiet, safe. Walter leaned back and closed his eyes. He could feel the exhaustion from hours spent navigating the snow, the cold, the fear of being left alone. It all seemed to weigh on him at once. Yet here, with Ryan and Rex, he felt a tentative relief, the first in a long time. Ryan sat back on his heels, resting his hands on his knees. "I have been in some tight spots before," he said, voice low and steady, "but never like this. You were alone out there, and the snow does not forgive easily." Walter nodded slowly, staring at the amber eyes of Rex, who shifted slightly, resting his head on the floor near Walter's boots. The dog had a sense of presence that felt almost human, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Walter took another sip of coffee and felt the warmth spread through him, slowly dissolving the numbness that had settled into his limbs. He glanced at Ryan. "You found me because of him?" he asked, nodding toward Rex. Ryan smiled faintly. "He would not let me leave you behind," he said. "He is a good partner. And sometimes, even the smallest instincts can change the course of things." Walter reached beneath his coat and touched the dog tag resting against his chest. The worn metal felt familiar, a connection to the past and to Margaret. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself a faint, fragile smile. He remembered the times he had carried his son from danger, from snow, from water, from all the small accidents that had threatened to break him. And now, here he was, carried forward by a stranger and a German shepherd, the weight of experience and kindness pushing him toward warmth and safety. Outside, the storm continued, snow piling against the walls, yet inside, Walter felt a growing sense of security. Each breath of warm air filled his lungs with relief and cautious hope. He leaned back, listening to the gentle shuffle of Rex moving on the floor, the low scrape of Ryan adjusting his position. For a moment, the hours of fear and isolation seemed to dissolve, replaced by the understanding that he was not alone. That even in the coldest, harshest moments, there were hands, paws, and hearts that would reach for him, carrying him through the night toward the promise of survival and the quiet comfort of being seen and protected. The night deepened around the cabin, the storm outside painting the world in unbroken white. Inside, the fire flickered, casting shadows across the walls, warming the small space with a steady glow. Walter sat quietly, hands wrapped around the mug Ryan had refilled, watching steam curl into the air. His eyes followed Rex as the dog shifted slightly, laying his head against the floor and then lifting it to glance at Walter again, amber eyes alert and patient. Ryan leaned back against the wooden wall, his gaze calm but thoughtful, studying the veteran with a measured attention that carried a weight of unspoken respect. Walter took a slow breath, feeling the warmth spread through his chest and into his limbs. The cold from the snow, the wind, and the long hours outside seemed to melt away in this small haven. Then, almost imperceptibly, a memory surfaced. A distant day in a faraway place, decades earlier, where he had once carried a fellow soldier from a battlefield, shielding him with his own body, whispering promises that they would survive. That same instinct, that same quiet determination, now seemed mirrored in the dog at his side. Walter lifted the dog tag from beneath his coat, tracing the worn edges with his fingers. It was small, simple, and yet carried the weight of a lifetime of choices, of sacrifice, of love. He felt the pulse of life in it as he held it against his chest, a reminder that some promises endure through time and hardship. Ryan noticed the gesture and allowed a faint nod, understanding the unspoken language of remembrance and respect. Outside, the wind rattled against the cabin, snow building against the door, but inside there was a sense of stillness, a pause from the relentless motion of the world. Walter set the mug down and exhaled slowly. "I did not realize how much I had carried until now," he said quietly, voice low, almost a whisper. Rex lifted his head and patted closer, pressing against Walter's leg, warm and steady, an anchor in the cold and silence. Ryan shifted, leaning forward slightly, speaking softly. "Sometimes the past catches up in the quietest ways. It can be painful, it can be revealing, but it also reminds us that we are never truly alone." Walter allowed himself a small smile, the kind that comes after long endurance and recognition of the good that still exists in the world. He thought of Margaret, of Ethan, of the battles that had shaped him, and of the path that had led him here, to warmth, to safety, to the trust extended by another and a companion who needed no words to convey loyalty. Hours passed in silence, the kind that holds more meaning than conversation. Walter watched the firelight dance across the walls, letting each flicker remind him of the fragile and persistent gift of life, of second chances, and of the quiet miracles that arrive not with fanfare, but in the steadfast presence of those who care, of those who notice, and of those who do not turn away even when the world outside howls and the snow drifts higher and higher. Morning arrived slowly. The storm had weakened during the night, leaving the mountains buried beneath fresh snow that sparkled under a pale winter sun. Golden light filtered through the cabin windows, painting warm streaks across the wooden floor. Walter woke to the smell of coffee and the soft crackling of the fire. For a brief moment, he forgot where he was. Then he saw Rex lying near the hearth, one ear raised as if standing watch even in sleep. The sight brought an unexpected sense of comfort. Ryan stood near the small kitchen counter, staring at his phone. His expression had changed. The calm ease from the night before was gone. Walter noticed immediately. Years of reading faces had taught him that much. "Something happened?" Walter asked quietly. Ryan looked up and hesitated. Outside, the wind rattled a loose shutter against the cabin wall. Rex lifted his head and walked toward them, sensing the shift in mood. Ryan slowly sat down across from Walter and placed the phone on the table. "A gas station about 20 miles south has security cameras," he said. Walter remained silent. Ryan continued. "The sheriff's office reviewed footage from yesterday afternoon after I reported finding you in the mountains." Walter lowered his eyes toward the steam rising from his coffee mug. Somehow he already knew where this conversation was going. Ryan's voice remained gentle. "The footage shows your truck stopping for fuel before heading into the mountains." Walter nodded once. "And?" Ryan exhaled slowly. "The timeline does not match what was reported afterward." The room fell quiet. Snow slipped from the roof outside with a soft thump. Rex moved closer until his shoulder touched Walter's leg. The old veteran reached down and rested a hand on the dog's neck. The warmth of the thick fur steadied him. Ryan glanced toward the window. "The sheriff spoke with several people this morning. Questions are being asked." Walter looked down at the worn dog tag resting against his chest beneath his sweater. For years he had believed that time solved everything, that patience healed wounds, that family always found its way back together. Yet sitting there, he realized some truths eventually rise to the surface no matter how deeply they are buried. What surprised him most was not anger. It was sorrow, deep sorrow for a son who had become lost. Outside, the clouds began breaking apart, revealing patches of blue sky over the mountains. Ryan's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and frowned. More information came in. Walter looked up. Ryan's eyes softened. "The sheriff wants to speak with you when the road's clear." Walter nodded slowly. Across the room, sunlight caught the edge of his dog tag, making the worn metal briefly shine. Rex noticed it immediately. The German shepherd stood, walked closer, and pressed his nose gently against the old tag hanging from Walter's hand. Ryan watched the gesture and suddenly froze. His eyes locked onto the engraved name and service number. For several long seconds, he said nothing at all. Then he whispered a single sentence that made Walter's heart stop. My father used to talk about that name. The cabin fell silent. Even the fire seemed quieter as Ryan stared at the worn dog tag in Walter's hand. Rex sat between them, his amber eyes moving from one man to the other. Outside, sunlight reflected off the snowfields, turning the mountains into a sea of silver and gold. Walter slowly lowered the tag. "Your father?" he asked. Ryan nodded. His voice was softer now. "My father served overseas before I was born. When I was a kid, he told me about a man who saved his life during a terrible night. He said he never got the chance to properly thank him." Ryan swallowed and looked directly at Walter. That man was Walter Hayes. For a moment, neither spoke. Walter felt as if the years had folded together. Memories long buried drifted back like snowflakes on the wind. Faces, voices, promises made in difficult places. He had never thought about being anyone's hero. He had simply done what needed to be done. Ryan smiled faintly. "My father carried your name with him for the rest of his life." Walter looked away toward the window. Emotion tightened his throat. All those years he had wondered whether any of his sacrifices mattered. Yet somehow, through decades and distance, kindness had found its way back to him. Rex moved closer and rested his head on Walter's knee. The old veteran gently stroked the dog's ears. Days later, after the roads reopened, Walter spoke with the sheriff. The truth about that winter afternoon came into the light. But Walter asked for something unexpected. He asked for mercy where others expected anger. He asked that people remember pain often creates poor choices and that healing begins when someone decides to stop carrying bitterness. The sheriff listened quietly. Spring arrived slowly in Montana. Snow retreated from the valleys. Wildflowers appeared along the hillsides. The world softened again. Walter never returned to living alone. Ryan insisted there was plenty of room near his property. What began as a temporary arrangement slowly became something neither man had expected. Family. Some evenings they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains orange and crimson. Rex always lay between them, content and watchful. Walter often carried his dog tag in his pocket, not because he needed to remember the past anymore, but because it reminded him of something greater. Life has a strange way of bringing people together when they need each other most. One warm evening, months after the storm, Walter sat at a wooden dinner table. Ryan was laughing at a story from town. Rex slept beside the fireplace, one paw twitching in a dream. The house smelled of roast chicken, fresh bread, and pine drifting through an open window. Walter looked around the room and smiled. The miracle had never been surviving the snow. The miracle was discovering that even after loss, disappointment, and loneliness, there were still people willing to open a door, share a meal, and remind a weary soul that home is not a place. Home is the people who choose not